Well, hello and good evening, everybody. And we're going to get started with this is part nine of How Wealth Rules the World. And just just so I could confuse everyone, part nine is actually chapter eight in the book. And the reason for that is because I also covered the introduction at the beginning of the webinars. And so last month, we covered a chapter that was called The Pretense of Representation. And so, overall, what we're looking at in this book is historically, legally, the legislatively, the various mechanisms that have been used to limit and, frankly, just extinguish the idea of government by the people. And the people, I don't mean corporations. I don't want to confuse anyone who thinks they're people, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're looking at is the various mechanisms. And last month, the pretense of representation, we talked a bit about things that you're very familiar with, probably like gerrymandering, and the realization that originally there were no voting districts of the sort that there are now, that are divided up between the two privately incorporated political parties, the Democrats and the Republican. They are actually private corporations, but they get to pick how to lump voters together according to constitutional mandate that there has to be a roughly equivalent population in each of the congressional districts. And we know that that's manipulated in order to favor one party or the other, depending on which one's in power at the time that the districts are redrawn. There are other ways, of course, as well that generally aren't too well understood or talked about. And historically, one of the ways that astonished me as I became more and more familiar with it was how, with the increase in American population from immigrants from Europe between the 1830s and the early 1900s, 30 some million people came to the United States, and most of them settled in the larger population centers, the cities. What happened with the balance of political power at that time was that the very influential, in other words, the wealthy folks who were able and had a pretty free hand at the municipal local level in controlling things politically, saw their proportion of political power diminishing as the population rose and as, frankly, less affluent folks were having a voice in politics, and were really taking over in Maine. In Maine, it was not Maine, the state, but in the Maine, it was the Democratic Party that those folks were really taking the reins of. What we talked about last month had to do with diminishing intentionally what kind of results those newcomers could get through the electoral process, through political involvement at the local level. And the way that worked was by the state legislatures, which were still controlled by the wealthier class, prevailing on the legislatures to diminish the powers of municipalities and what they could legislate on locally. And it was really about protecting rights vested in property. And so really the investing class and the wealthy class, they did not want the common folks, the rabble, to in any way have any impact on their taxes, on their ability to make profits, and so forth. And so back when municipalities had a fair amount of local lawmaking power, that was found to be inconvenient by the elites. As we know today, some of you that I've worked with have tried to stop things like fracking or gold mines or you name it. And you understand the uphill battle it is to get authorization to protect your community and your style of life, really, your quality of life. And that's a direct result of changes that were made in order to diminish the power of the masses at the municipal level. And if there are any questions from last month, I'll try to cover them briefly now before we dive into today's chapter. Anything that's still kind of held over, things you've been thinking about since? If not, we'll dive in. And we're going to be covering a chapter that's titled Creditors and Cannibals. And as usual, I start each chapter with a quote. This quote is from Patrick Colquhoun. And Patrick was a merchant who set up England's first private, what they called preventative police force, to prevent dock workers from supplementing their meager wages with stolen goods. And here's what Patrick had to say about poverty. Poverty is that state and condition in society where the individual has no surplus labor in store, or, in other words, no property or means of subsistence, but what is derived from the constant exercise of industry in the various occupations of life. Poverty is therefore a most necessary and indispensable ingredient in society, without which nations and communities could not exist in a state of civilization. It is the lot of man. It is the source of wealth, since without poverty, there could be no labor, there could be no riches, no refinement, no comfort, and no benefit to those who may be possessed of wealth. And from what I know about Patrick, I think he said that with a straight face. And he meant it. That if we're going to have the civilization, we're just going to have to endure poverty. Of course, it's only the poor who have to endure it. So moving on to the first section, and it is titled, No Property, No Rights. Debt is a claim of ownership by the wealthy of the productive capacity of other people. Today, it's a claim with global reach, thanks to neoliberal policies. The world has seen the muscles and brains of paupers harnessed to the will of an opulent minority for the building of empire. In North America, a wealthy aristocracy fueled by stolen labor went well beyond constitutionalized slavery and embraced Alexander Hamilton's notion of a profit-making, self-perpetuating engine for economic growth, fueled by debt. Creating profit from debt is no more novel than the idea of planned scarcity driving up prices and hence profits. A scarcity of money is as effective as a scarcity of food or water in compelling unbanked and underbanked people to sell their labor at cut rate. What's needed today and can't wait for tomorrow can be bought on credit, the collateral being an excessive obligation to perform future work in payment. The origin of Hamilton's dominion-making machine goes back to the privatization of the commons in England, where land never owned by anyone was privatized by legal fiat, fenced and titled with legal deeds. This era of confiscation of public assets for transfer into private ownership created a huge difference in the amount of property owned by a small minority of privileged men. The people dispossessed of their traditional homes were given the option of staying on the land as serfs who would owe a significant portion of their crops and labor to the lord who now owned the manor. This debt was an artificial creation of law, a kind of anti-property that illustrates how granting property privileges for some can only be sustained by taking freedom from servitude from the rest.
Ben, when was this?
I'm sorry, the enclosures.
Mhm.
Actually, it spanned quite um, a stretch of years, but really beginning in the 1500s, it got under full steam. So in England, the property class enacted a whole set of laws collectively known as the Terrors, which, among other things, criminalized vagabonds who refused to stay in servitude on privatized land. The crime of being landless and masterless, akin to being undocumented today, was punishable by imprisonment and torture. Mercantilists could legally kidnap vagrants and force them into indentured servitude. In the New World, in the Americas, um, in the colonies, that were similarly stolen from indigenous people and then privatized. Linebaugh and Rediker wrote that, quote, in England, the expropriation of the peasantry was accomplished by systematic violence and terror, organized through the criminal sanction, public searches, the prisons, martial law, capital punishment, banishment, forced labor, and colonization, end quote. Today, the criminalization and enslavement of people in poverty is better camouflaged, no less oppressive, though. Victimless criminals are said to owe a debt to society. The labor of predominantly African American prisoners is rented out to corporate masters while their civil rights, including the right to vote, are suspended. Debt is the new face of enslavement. No clearer current example presents itself than the so-called student loan debt crisis. Wealthy lenders now legally own the future labor of a whole generation, and those debtor scholars have no means of escape from debt slavery because law favors rights in property over rights in people. Usury, that is, high interest rates for the least privileged, creates wealth for the creditor, indenturing the future labor of the debtor and suspending the right of freedom from servitude. And that's the end of that little section. Any comments or questions? Samantha?
I remember this was years and years ago. I was in law school and I did not do well in contract law, but what I do remember from it is the notion of consideration. And that kind of popped up when you use the word collateral. And I'm just kind of wondering, is there a connection there between how banks currently operate issuing debt with the collateral being the future labor? Is there consideration for this future labor? Because I'm wondering if the contracts are even enforceable that way.
Well, that's an interesting question, and probably we could spend the whole evening just talking about that and contracts. But without giving a side course on contract law, when the enclosures were in full swing, there was no consideration. In other words, the folks who were told you can't live here anymore, even though your family has for generations beyond memory, you can't live here anymore because the king gave this piece of land to Baron so and so, and he's putting a fence up around the perimeter, and you can stay as a serf. And if you do, you'll grow your crops and you'll owe a portion of them to your master. And if you don't, then get the heck out. If you're not going to do that, get out. There wasn't any payment to those, um, well, dehomed people. They didn't collect a fair wage for it. It wasn't like the theory when when government takes property for a public use, and the law says there has to be just compensation for it. That's the Fifth Amendment right of property owners under in the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. There was no such thing at that time in England. When you think about the student loan, I think there would be an argument saying, yeah, well, there's consideration. We're giving you this amount of money so you can get your college degree and have your career and make an income over your lifetime. But of course, there's a combined, two-pronged attack on the students. The first one is skyrocketing tuitions, um, tuitions that have gone up not at the rate of inflation, not matching cost of living kinds of things, but just it has gone up astronomically without reason. It's just a matter of making more money. If you want your law degree, if you want to become a doctor, even if you want to become, get your MBA, whatever it might be, yeah, you're going to take out a loan and you may come out and be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Well, gee, I hope it was worth it. And I hope you really do get that really good job so you can pay it off fast. But in the majority, that's not the way it works out. You know, people go to college, they come out, and they don't necessarily land the best job you've ever heard of and get out from under the student loan. Um, there seems to be some indication that there is intentionality behind keeping them in debt as well, considering that the bankruptcy laws, which are very favorable to corporations that go bankrupt, aren't so favorable to students who are told, sorry, but you can't simply declare bankruptcy the way that ExxonMobil can if they ever needed to. There is no escape from your debt. So contract law, well, interesting. Does it have something to do with it? Yeah. And I would say likely that the lenders, the creditors would argue that's the case. Oh, yeah, well, the students didn't have to go to college or they didn't have to go to that college. Sure, right. That's true. Just like the employee handbook that you have to sign off on and give away your rights to assembly, your right to free speech on the job, things like that. It's like, well, it was that or not get this job. Well, you could have had any job. Well, pretty much every job has a employee handbook with similar provisions in it. So contracts, when they're coercive, are they actually able to? Are they doing what contracts were supposed to do, which was to be a mutually agreed upon deal? When it's only one way, when the credit card company hands you the application for the credit card and you read the fine print, have you ever tried to scratch out the things you don't like and put in the things you do and mail it back to them? And did you really expect you get the card then? No, there's no negotiation. This is an actual contract. The argument in the country today is, of course it is. You don't have to sign it. You don't have to get a credit card. Well, you do have to get a credit card to get some credit so that you can buy a house, so you can do other things. I mean, it's all such a mesh. It's all such a matrix of obligations on the debtor that the choices are very limited. It can be argued that you don't have to do those things. It can be argued that you could decide to drop out, live on the street. You would have no debt, and you wouldn't have your right to be free from servitude violated. Well, that's a hell of a choice.
You see the
I
raised
don't.
hand, Ben?
I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry, Jim.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm kind of naive about some of this stuff, but I have in the past heard from like Ellen Brown where they say, money is debt or something like that. I'm just curious if that's something that resonates with you or if you have anything to say.
Yeah, hang in there. We're going to touch on that, and it really is about the debt is a commodity, which is really interesting when you think that all those students, or me with my car loan, or you with your whatever loans you may have, that yeah, they're we're in an interesting situation where those debts can be bought and sold. So I have a mortgage and I get something in the mail that says, well, guess what? this bank no longer has your mortgage. Now it's this one over here. Oh, and they have a little different policy on things. Well, I never agreed to that. Where's the contract? Oh, it probably says so in the original contract that this loan can be exchanged, sold, the rest of it. Yeah, it's there. Oh, you wanted to buy the house? You'll have to sign that. You have to agree to it. It's just how business is done. And it's normalized, and we all take it for granted. Hahnemann?
Yeah, Ben, you do a great job of bringing all of these flaws to light, and I do appreciate it. And I'm constantly looking for solutions. And I'm wondering, because Hamilton was such a interesting character, is there any possibility of refuting some of the things that Hamilton brought to light?
Not till we get him off the $10 bill.
Yeah.
I'm being a little flip there. Tell you what, I'm going to get into the next section here. We're going to talk about Hamilton a little bit. If answers don't come to the last couple of questions, well, let's come back to them, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So the next section is titled The Rap on Alexander Hamilton. And yeah, it's a pun because there was a musical about Hamilton and it's in rap. So what's the rap on Alexander Hamilton? The Broadway musical Hamilton has given this Federalist counter-revolutionary misappropriated legitimacy as one of America's founding heroes. The misinformation about Hamilton has been amplified by lionizing him in rap and rhapsody. Here are a few sample lines from the live performance of the song, Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story? And I'm not singing it, by the way, no, I'm just reading it. Jefferson says, I'll give him this. His financial system is a work of genius. I couldn't undo it if I tried, and I tried. So, Hahnemann, to your question, do you think we can undo it? Jefferson, at least in the musical, says, nope. And then Madison answers Jefferson and says, he took our country from bankruptcy to prosperity. I hate to admit it, but he doesn't get enough credit for all the credit he gave us. A little punning going on there, too. So Alexander Hamilton, unlike Thomas Paine, is remembered in marble and bronze in the nation's capital. And his face is on the $10 bill. First Secretary of the Treasury under the Second Constitution, he tagged along with Washington throughout the Revolution. He also followed the general's lead when it came to cheating commoners out of what little they owned. He got so good at it that he made it the basis for enriching and empowering the new federal government and the class of men who forged it. It wasn't an arbitrary choice. He was preparing the new nation for continental expansion, hemispheric colonialism, and eventual global empire. Hamilton's grand idea was to make debt the cornerstone on which to build that empire. He saw the possibility of growing an empire by leveraging debt into a tool for spending borrowed money today for private gain and indenturing people without wealth to fund the Ponzi scheme with their future labor. The debt indentured commoners never contracted to be parties to the arrangement, nor had their children and grandchildren, speaking of contract law. Payments on this generalized debt are collected as taxes that pay for government and commercial infrastructure, along with whatever services are provided to the people to manage resistance and resentment. Publicly borrowed money spent on privatized national priorities are capitalized as treasury bonds that affluent speculators purchase and profit from in the process of impoverishing the community. The formula Hamilton created is simple enough. The governing property class borrows in the name of the people to pay for everything from wars to subsidies for their corporations. They use the loans for their own ends, buy up interest accumulating bonds created to capitalize the debt, then make the people pick up the tab and pay both the principal and interest on the loan through perpetual taxes that require indentured labor over lifetimes and generations. As you might imagine, retired American revolutionaries opposed this scheme when it was implemented. Within 2 years of adoption of the federal Constitution, they rose up armed and ready to continue the fight against oppressive government. Hamilton put his plan into action by first proposing that the Revolutionary War debt should be assumed by the federal government. He sent his report on public credit to Congress, and his measures were approved in the summer of 1790. Against the protest of states that had paid off their debts, the central government took on the debt of the other states and blended it in with the debt owed under the Articles of Confederation. The new Federalist government then assumed all of it as debt owed by the whole of the American people. With that, he also created a need to raise new revenues to pay for the debt. The revolution had been fought and financed by both foreign and domestic soldiers and financiers. Congress rejected proposals to default on paying foreign debt and adopted a policy of paying speculators in domestic war bonds in full with interest in hard currency. But when it came time to honor IOUs issued to retired soldiers for their military service in the Revolution, the federal government adopted a very different policy. The men who fought the British Empire frequently sold their promissory notes to speculators to pay their own taxes and debts during and after the war. When Congress suggested paying the soldiers at full face value for their service and reimbursing the speculators only for the purchase cost of those securities, Hamilton objected and he got his way. Only current holders of the soldiers' promissory notes, their promised pay, would receive full payment plus interest. Hamilton called it redemption. The wages of soldiers who fought for independence was personal property, not privileged property. In desperate need of some income while they marched off to battle, they sold their government-issued promissory notes, and in the end, they got the speculators pennies on the dollar for their military service. A contract under duress promises no justice. The intent of Hamilton's plan was to make the public debt a reliable generator of capital by making government securities attractive to investors and speculators. Creating profit for some from the public debt demanded general austerity, poverty to ensure the need for borrowing and the full taxation of labor, but not dividends. When Hamilton proposed levying a tax on domestically produced distilled spirits in 1791, the Federalist was faced with its first domestic insurrection. Revolutionary veterans in Western Pennsylvania had no access to markets for their grain crops. They made whiskey as a portable, non-spoiling product that they used in place of hard currency, which was really difficult to come by at the time. The imposition of the first federal excise tax brought families on the frontier to the brink of bankruptcy. Farms and land were lost to the tax collectors. In 1791, the year the whiskey tax was levied, the citizens banded together and formed a militia. They blocked tax auctions of property. They chased tax collectors out. And in 1792, Hamilton prevailed on President Washington to send troops into the frontier to crush the revolt. He wrote the executive order himself. It was the first use of federal force against U.S. citizens. The troops marched across Pennsylvania against the protest of anti-Federalist Governor Thomas Mifflin. They were on a mission to preserve Hamilton's creditor-debtor scheme for raising capital. They were sent to ensure that speculators in government war bonds would continue to profit from their investments and that average Americans would pay them their speculative earnings from the sweat of their brows. Today, there's little motivation for a government built to incentivize exponential property accumulation to step in to secure human rights when debt slavery is the engine of commerce, trade, wealth generation, and progress under capitalism. Law is at the service of the creditors, so much so The courts can garnish wages of debtors to transfer payment for work done by the debtor to the creditor without the consent of the one doing the work. The debtor is a slave not only to the creditor, but to the law. Aside from barring states from impairing the obligation of contracts, that's Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 of the Constitution, in which the contract clause is embedded, declared that, quote, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. It was a promise to speculators and investors in government securities that they would receive full payment in hard currency from the public treasury, and that debt relief policies would not be erected by the states. In fact, they were forbidden by the U.S. Constitution. Thomas Jefferson commented on Hamilton's plan to use debt as the engine for progress in building his desired empire in a letter to John Taylor, U.S. Senator from Virginia, saying, quote, and I sincerely believe that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale, end quote. Today, contrary to common sense, the economy is said to thrive when debtors suffer and especially when they fail to extricate themselves from poverty. David Korten wrote that, quote, a group of mid-19th century economists turned away from the disciplined, reality-based study of the institutional dynamics of political economies and turned economics into a money-focused discipline based on a mathematical formula adopted from physics using bogus assumptions. The resulting phantom wealth economics values money more than life and organizes around the logic of finance rather than the logic of living systems. Phantom wealth economists teach and celebrate the moral code of the psychopath. Phantom wealth economists are easily identified. They focus on financial returns rather than returns to the health of people and the rest of nature, end quote. In an interview with Counterpunch, economist Michael Hudson commented, quote, we called up the Bureau of Economic Analysis that publishes the GDP statistics. I asked what happens when the credit card companies make more money on penalties than they make in interest. The answer they gave us was, and this is a quote from them, that's not interest. We count that as a financial service, and financial services are an addition to GDP. And then the quote goes on, so all the added penalties that people pay for falling behind in their debts for arrears are counted as a growth in GDP, as economic growth, end quote. Minj Cha at Demos gives this basic equation. Another quote, GDP is a measure of raw economic activity, not a complete picture of economic progress. The formula used to calculate GDP is GDP equals consumption plus private investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. GDP cannot distinguish between a positive economic indicator like increased spending due to more disposable income and a negative economic indicator like increased spending on credit cards due to loss of wages or declining real value of wages, end quote. Economic indicators can reflect the financial health of commoners, but indicators on which national economic and trade policies are based pointedly do not. Domestic economic policies justified by GDP figures benefit extractive exploitation of natural so-called resources too. The formula helps mask the hidden costs to the global population and future generations by counting nature's bounty as a limitless source of profit. Minj Cha explains that, quote, preserving the country's natural resources essential to our current and future wealth is not counted, but exploiting them in an unsustainable manner is. Only when natural resources are sold or somehow commoditized do they show up in GDP calculations. For example, if all of the fish in the sea were caught and sold in 1 year, global GDP would skyrocket, even though the fishing industry itself would collapse and the broader ecosystem would be damaged irrevocably. As shown, our economic growth is increasing at a rate that cannot be ecologically sustained. End quote. It's the policies based on this formula that continue to benefit a tiny minority of wealthy people. But it's not just a benefit to them, it's a revocation of the equality of all people and a measure of just how firmly wealth controls the governance of the nation and the world. Minj Cha wraps up her comments saying this, quote, if poverty rates, inequality levels, natural capital accounts, and other metrics were taken into account as heavily as GDP, then different policies and priorities would begin to emerge. Instead, we are now focused solely on increasing GDP, even though increasing poverty rates, inequality levels, and other societal indicators show that in many ways we are experiencing growth without progress. End quote. The irony is that personal debt is counted as an indicator of economic growth. The GDP counts personal debt on the profit side of the equation. This demonstrates the point that debt is the engine of commerce and empire. It's counted in the column of future profits to be made by cashing in on the indentured value of labor, which has been posted in the statistics as collateral owed to creditors by debtors. Although debtor prisons were outlawed in the US in 1833, it has been reported that ex-President Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, uses the courts to jail underprivileged tenants in his housing complexes when they fall behind in their rent, while at the same time collecting millions in rent subsidies from the federal government, all paid for by the rest of us. In the confrontation between the legal privileges of wealth and the unalienable rights of people, the law sides with the accumulation of wealth through garnishment, incarceration, indentureship, in fact, modern slavery. Always, the rights of property give the materially advantaged power over the unalienable right of those without it and to own the future of their own labor. And that's the end of that subsection. I'll pause if there's any questions or comments. Does it strike you as kind of odd that the GDP is calculated the way that these scholars say it is? The more indebted we become, the better the economy is. I mean, when I watch, which is very seldom, when I watch a news program and they have their report about the, how's the stock market doing? And I've frequently heard these talking heads have conversations along the lines of, well, I guess the message hasn't gotten through to the mass of people out there that the economy's doing really well because they're just complaining like crazy and they're acting like things aren't getting any better. Well, gee, they aren't. But that's not counted. That is actually an invisible fact. And invisible facts are dangerous, especially if what you expect or hope for is an informed public that can engage their elected officials. Oh, they certainly can't get around the calculations for the GDP. Hahnemann?
Yeah, I really wonder if this upcoming election in 2024 is going to bring that more clearly into people's minds, because I'm really thinking that President Biden, as well as he seems to think Bidenomics is doing, is not going to bring people on board, and he's not going to win the election. and we know who we're going to get as a dictator of the USA. You have thoughts on that?
I could speculate endlessly, but I don't have a crystal ball, honestly. But what you're saying, I think makes sense. And regardless of who wins, this system isn't going to change. Not from either of the candidates. I don't think any of that'll change. Well, I feel very certain that it won't. And that's the question when we keep getting a choice between this one and that one, and neither one will do anything that will change the system. I've heard various quotes on this, but one of them goes like, stop voting; it only encourages them. And I'm not telling you what you should do or not do with your votes, but kind of made some sense. Samantha, what you got?
Ben, do you not see my hand?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think Heidi had her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Samantha's I see hers, and it's the color. It's orange, and yours is up against the wall in your picture, and I didn't see it.
Oh, well, whoever's in the upper left-hand corner is always the next in line.
Oh, well, see, I'm just such a dinosaur. Go ahead. Sorry, Heidi.
I just wondered. I mean, Samantha can go first, but
No, go ahead, please.
I was wondering why you weren't seeing it. Okay. So if this system is so rotten, which it is, how has it lasted for 250 years? Well, not quite 250, but yeah, close. And I have just so many questions. There were a few people in here that are anti-federalists that you've quoted from, and so I'm kind of wondering about the numbers, like how. I mean, you've done all this research, and part of my question is like, how'd you find this stuff? Because certainly we don't hear about it. You've connected so many dots and pulled so much stuff together. But like Jefferson, and then obviously he has support as anti-federalist. Like I'm just curious. I mean, obviously they were way outnumbered, but
they actually weren't. The anti-federalists were in the majority before the Constitution was ratified. And when you think about who were the delegates to the state conventions that were considering whether or not to adopt the proposed Constitution, well, they were the well-educated. They may not have been the wealthiest in the community, but they were generally better read and better financed than the rest of the community. And so when they were approached with this new Constitution, the proposal by the Federalist folks, generally there was resistance in the states. They said, this looks like a dangerous direction to go, centralizing power, putting all the power in a central government as opposed to the independent sovereign states, moving the power away from people a big leap further. What convinced the anti-federalists in those ratifying conventions to ratify the second Constitution, the one we have today, was that they negotiated and they argued, and they were told they would get a Bill of Rights. Well, the Bill of Rights was enacted 2 years after the federal Constitution was, but we got it. There were 50 or so different rights that were proposed. Madison was the primary editor, if you will, and he whittled it from 50 to 10. And he picked the 10 that he could live with. But the anti-federalists agreed to go along with the new Constitution so long as they got the Bill of Rights. Well, as we talked about in an earlier session, when you look to find out who gained rights when the Bill of Rights were enacted 2 years later, who gained rights that didn't have them before they were enacted? And the answer is nobody. What they did, and essentially they promised the folks who, the anti-federalists, the folks who were opposed to the adoption of the Constitution, in the main, they were persuaded to go along with the Constitution because at least they wouldn't lose any rights if it was enacted. Because they were told they get a Bill of Rights and their rights would be protected, even though they weren't among the richest of the rich. Their rights would still be protected because they owned property, they owned land, so they were, they're in the in crowd. Where do you find things like this? Where do I dig all this stuff up? I have a curious mind, and I think probably all of you do too, or you probably wouldn't be here listening to me go on about this stuff. But when I learned that the anti-federalists were in the majority, and in the largest majority among the common folks, that they were, if we could call them anti-federalists, had no interest in centralizing the government this way. They had no interest in adopting a new constitution that was its original primary purpose for getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and taking on this new one was to get a commerce clause that would take the authority of the individual states to make decisions about commerce across state lines, take that power away from the states and put it into a central government, into the Congress. That's what the Commerce Clause did. That's what they said they wanted. It was really a matter of trying to get the states, those governments were closer to the people who were considered people at the time. That's white men with property. But even those folks, the commoners who still had some land and so forth, the Federalists didn't want them running things. It needed to be an aristocracy. So when I read about things like that, then I ask myself, so why did they want a Bill of Rights then? Why did they settle for that for their vote for the Constitution? Oh, it wasn't going to give rights to all the folks that they represented in the state. It was just going to give it to them. That explains why women and African Americans and Native Americans, everybody else has been fighting to be recognized under the Bill of Rights ever since, because it didn't apply to them. That's why we have these civil rights movements, because it never has applied to everybody equally. Curious minds want to know why. And that's why I dug into these things. And I'm sorry, Samantha, I've had your hand up now for a good while. Go ahead.
That's okay. I think you just sort of commented on what I was going to comment on a little bit. It's just sort of interesting to me the way that you mentioned how personal debts are sort of put in the profits category. And that just reminded me of accounts receivable for businesses and how businesses are somehow able to function seemingly well, having just accounts receivables without adding an interest on those accounts for non-payment. I mean, you can go after them other ways, but they seem to do well, and it just operates based on the market fluctuations. So I guess the government didn't want to hash their bets on whether people would be okay with their system or not.
And clearly, when it comes to accounts receivable, your customers are in a different relationship to you as a business person than the common working class and their relationship to the government. The government just spends and spends and invades countries here and there and never worries about what it's going to cost. But boy, you try to raise, some kind of social benefits for people, and you're going to hear all kinds of things about how we can't afford that. Why is that? Because the debtor class, the working class, that's who end up paying off the foreign debt and the trade deficits and the rest of it. That's who ends up paying for that deep debt. The government isn't going to give back to the people that they're fleecing. Frankly, they're not going to give anything to the. We're not going to put wool coats on our sheep. Why do that? We're taking their wool. We're not giving them wool. We are the sheep, and the wool isn't ours, even if it's growing on our backs. So I'm going to go ahead and move on here and see if we can finish up a little bit here. The next section is called Wetiko over honor. Wetiko, it's Wetiko, and it is a Native American word. Adam Smith's 1776 blockbuster Wealth of Nations is regularly used as an argument for a kind of capitalism given life by Hamilton. But Smith made no excuse for the property class when he wrote that, quote, civil government, so far as it is instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have none at all. End quote. The human spirit is capable of generosity, honesty, even honor. But the materialistic imperative to acquire more wealth at all costs channels an undeserving propertied minority into brittle indifference to community and human lives. It encourages sterile rationalizations wrapped up in an it's the law mentality that makes it possible for some entrepreneurs to use their wealth like bait. They attract the poor to borrow from them and then trap their prey into lengthy, if not lifelong, servitude, depriving the poor of the only asset they have, their own labor, creates greater and greater concentrations of wealth and widespread misery. When they borrow, average Americans assume responsibility to work off their debt. Their ethical grounding in how to treat fellow members of society is a known human trait. Taking advantage of that honorable sentiment towards social indebtedness has become an acceptable business practice. The business of profit-driven creditors is to create an economy that traps people in poverty. They're vulnerable to financial blackmail of a kind that is today treated as if it were a helping hand offered from above. But the real effect is to establish a class of low-paid workers who will perpetually struggle to hand over their earnings as compounding interest. The poor, for much of their working lives, will continue to borrow back a portion of their appropriated wages to make ends meet. Those in need who turn to means of subsistence other than debt slavery are frequently criminalized. Taking advantage of people with few legal options for survival is a dishonorable enterprise with deep historic roots. Materialism and empire continue to sever people from nature and the land while forcing them into dependency on a legalistic construct engineered for human husbandry. The imagery of debtors getting fleeced is apt, but treating other people as prey is both figuratively and literally cannibalistic, whether it is their flesh, their labor, or their minds that is consumed. Native American scholar Jack D. Forbes wrote about what he called, quote, the disease of the consuming of other creatures' lives and possessions. I call it cannibalism. Whatever we call it, this disease, this Wetiko psychosis, is the greatest epidemic sickness known to man. The rape of a woman, the rape of a land, and the rape of a people, they're all the same. The nice people in the offices, the typists, the lab technicians, the clerks, and of course the owners, directors, stockholders, senators, generals, and presidents who use profit from and feed on human exploitation are also cannibals to one degree or another. The most guilty of the Wetiko are, I would think, those who mastermind, justify, and profit from such systems. Such persons are the master predators. And that is a real term in Native American societies, the Wetiko. It is seen as a mental sickness, and they see this whole culture as having as harboring that disease. Treating the resources of the earth as inexhaustibly extractable property may not feel like cannibalism to people from Western cultures. They don't see themselves as part of nature or nature as a living entity the way Aboriginal people do. Glimpsing the gluttonous, arrogant behavior patterns that treat other people and the whole world as separate, unequal, and exploitable, we get a peek into the pantry of capitalism. The premises used to justify economic predation deserve scrutiny. In America, the Federalist legacy has been grafted onto our brains to justify the accumulation of privileged property while making whole societies and the natural world pay the price. We've inherited a system of law that justifies, legalizes, and constitutionalizes the whole swindle. That it is wrapped in a near replica of the flag of the British East India Company against which American revolutionaries went to war is precious irony. You may remember a couple of months ago, I mentioned in one of the sections of a chapter that the American flag, the stars and stripes and all of that, is almost the same flag as the one flown by the British East India Company, the corporation whose tea was dumped into Boston Harbor, the Boston Tea Party and all of that. The difference is that we now have a field, blue field with white stars on it. The East India Company had 13 stripes, red and white, and up in the box in the corner, it had the British cross, and that was the difference. Moving on to the next section, unless there's a comment or question. Yeah, Jim.
Just really quick. I'm just curious if you have anything to say about like this notion of the free hand of the market. How does that relate to the debt? And is that just kind of propaganda to have us buy into this debt system?
Yeah, the free hand of the market. I'm just going to be sarcastic here and say it has the same reality value as Casper the Friendly Ghost. I could have picked anything, but that's what came to mind. Sorry. Anyway, invisible hand. Yeah. So the theory being that if everyone acts out of their own self-interest, out of their own greed, things are going to work out just fine. The invisible hand is going to be the combined energy of all of these Wetiko psychotic minds. I mean, that's what it is. Greed is the Wetiko disease that the Native Americans talk about. It's the desire to accumulate and have everything, more and more, hoarding, essentially, a hoarding disease. The invisible hand was mentioned once in that big, thick book by Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. And it was latched on as an apt metaphor for what the capitalists wanted to get across. They needed an image. They needed something. Alexander Hamilton, during the Constitution, they call it a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1786. Sorry, nobody elected them to go there. They went there to overturn the existing Constitution. That's why they were there, and they wanted to put in they wanted to have get rid of the state's power to regulate commerce. Where was I going with this? So I've lost my path. But at any rate, Hamilton's idea here, which we started out talking about, was brilliant in the eyes of the governing class, the wealthy folks. It was brilliant. It served their interests perfectly. It didn't serve the majority, but the majority were not considered to be people under for this Constitution. They weren't considered to have a stake in the governance of the country. And so don't worry about them. They'll just have to trust us. We're going to make the best decisions. But that invisible hand, yes, coming back to that, it's just, it's a metaphor. And I was going to say Hamilton's quoted from that convention as saying something along the lines of, "It said that the people's voice is the voice of God, but we know that's just not true." Oh, but the market is the hand of God, apparently. That's the invisible hand. So, the victors get to say what God wants.
Well, it seems to me that invisible hand is slapping us silly, and then they got the boot on our necks.
Hang in there. Hang in there. I'm going to go on to the next section. There's just a couple here now. Indenturing the future to the past.
So Ben, I was wondering if you have thought of, or maybe you've already done it, of sending your book to the writers of Hamilton.
No, I don't have any interest in it. There's also been, I learned recently that there was another, I don't know, stage show, musical or something that was put together essentially as a retort to Hamilton. And also, I understand that the author of Hamilton read only one book about Hamilton, and it was, one of those, Hamilton's my hero kind of authors. So he got what he got. Look, I'm not knocking the music. I've watched the show, and it's entertaining. It's just historically baloney. So, no, I don't think I need to send them a copy of it.
Well, maybe there's an anti-Hamilton play in the works.
No, I think there is one done. I don't know much about it, and artists and people in theater and so forth, they can write what they want. That's fine, and entertain all they want. Most historical stories are pretty heavily fictionalized anyway. I'm not too offended, other than being, other than wondering where the heck he ever got the story he put together.
Yeah, but theater is such a great way of getting the word out, and too bad it's just so wrong. But so what? So is so much else.
Well, and the other thing is, it also raises the opportunity for us to talk about it and to correct it. So I'll take that. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So on to indenturing the future to the past. In 1789, the year the Federalist Constitution was ratified without a Bill of Rights, Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison that, quote, "I set out on this ground which I suppose to be self-evident, that the earth belongs in usufruct to the living, that no man can by natural right oblige the lands he occupied or the persons who succeed him in that occupation to the payment of debts contracted by him. For if he could, he might during his own life eat up the usufruct of the lands for several generations to come, and then the lands would belong to the dead and not to the living, which would be the reverse of our principle." And that term usufruct, it's one of those legal terms, and it has to do with, so if you're occupying land, if you're living on it, you may own it, you may rent it, it may not be owned, you may be just sitting there, whatever. Usufruct is about, you have a right to live on a parcel of land, whether or not you own it, as long as it's not in violation of someone else's property interests. But the usufruct gives you the right to live off the land, but not to take so much from it that it can't produce for the next occupant and the next generation. We seem to have forgotten that notion of usufruct these days. Ended that quote, and now going on. Privileged property, cloaked in corporate attire and weaponized by law, has no scruples. When our children borrow for college and take on huge amounts of debt, they're literally being fed to the aristocrats running these profit extracting machines. Economic profit without personal labor is the appropriation of the labor of other human beings, backed by the legally protected authority to collect it. This system of debt servitude drives progress as Alexander Hamilton envisioned it would. Student debt in the United States for 2018 amounted to $1.48 trillion, not counting interest. That's 44 million young scholars in hock and owing a good portion of their productive years to owners of privileged property. Credit card debt in the US for the same year was $860 billion. Predatory lenders, by definition, approve loans even when the borrower has poor prospects of repaying the debt and the interest charged on time. It's a policy that extends the loan payments indefinitely and guarantees exponential profit. Financial predation by property's international empire follows the same pattern as domestic predation. It's the struggling countries that fall victim to international lenders. Closer to home, it's minorities, the poor, less educated, the elderly, and people in need of emergency financial relief who are generally targeted. Have a health emergency and no means to pay for it? You qualify for a loan from what looks like a financial institution, but is really the front office of a debt slave plantation where your hard work is the crop. Often, crushing debt leads to litigation between the lender and borrower, or more frequently, between the new owner of the debt and the original borrower, since debt is a commodity that generates profit and can be bought and sold. Although labor has been declared in the US law to be neither property nor a commodity, clearly it is both when a human being's obligation to work off debt can be sold and bought between investors. When it comes to a contest between rights of property and rights of people, litigation outcomes are predictable. Given the original bias of law under the Federalist Constitution in favor of property over people, debtors generally get the short end of the stick. And that's the end of that section. There's one more short section. Any thoughts or questions on indenturing the future to the past? So the next, okay, Jen?
Just really quickly, Jubilee. It's a wonderful word and concept. Anyway, that's all.
Definitely, it's a concept that erases debt periodically, and it makes sense. But then again, accumulating the debt to begin with may make no sense. There may be a better way. So, ghosts in the machine is our last section. When victims of credit's predation get to court, the words of dead Federalist counter-revolutionaries like Hamilton and Marshall can be heard passing the lips of judges in every courthouse throughout the land. Attorneys dig deep into the grimoire of the law. They repeat footnoted spells and intone unctuous prayers to the blindfolded idol of justice. But justice is gagged as well as blindfolded. She has no voice. She has been checked and balanced with the priorities of wealth. Commoners fall prey to the lure of loans fabricated with impervious mathematical formula wrapped up in the form of a private contract. In immediate need of financial relief, the poor sign. But when the oppressive weight of indentureship emerges from the math into their everyday lives, they discover that public law binds them in servitude to honor their private law of contract. They hire a lawyer if they can afford one. They gather solemnly in court and plead their case. The seance is over when the Federalists have had their say. The controversy is resolved in favor of the owner of their productive future labor because the object of the law is to preserve the rights of property, not the rights of people. Courthouse facades are scattered across the continent like necropolis erected for the veneration of dead Federalists. The nation they envisioned, governed by the opulent, is safeguarded within those temples to materialism day by day. This law, all the law actually, interpreted by its robed ministers, consecrate property and anoint it against all transgressions. End of chapter. And next month, we'll reconvene for the chapter that's titled Property's International Empire. And so we've been focused on how much of this system was cooked up here in the United States. And next month, we're going to consider how it's been exported and this idea of, neoliberalism and globalism, how these ideas, we actually have essentially contract clause and commerce clause on the international scale these days. Jen? Go ahead. You're muted.
Okay, me? Just a really quick, like sort of a tongue in cheek, but I'm half serious. When Citizens United happened, they claimed that corporations were people, right? Well, I was thinking, what would be an absurd, possibly absurd reaction from the left, right? Like, could we make potlucks people? Yeah, because that's where we gather. That's where we get things done, in potlucks. Anyway.
Well, the thing is, Jim, that actually corporate personhood didn't just start with Citizens United. As a matter of fact, 1886 was Santa Clara case where corporations were recognized to have equal protection of the law under the 14th Amendment. 1889, 2 years later, they got due process of the law. And just over the years, we had various court cases before the Supreme Court. 1922, the Supreme Court gave corporations the Fifth Amendment's takings clause. It was actually in 1978 in the Bellotti case that corporations first got free speech rights. That was 1978. The Citizens United case simply expanded on the Bellotti decision and disallowed the states and the federal government from regulating the purchase of elections at all, because they equated money with speech for corporations. Since corporations are persons, but not people, they don't have mouths. Corporations have a right to First Amendment free speech. How can they express themselves? Not with words out of their mouths, then with money, which is, it's a really dangerous decision that was made. And since then, 2010, we can see what the outcome's been. It was horrible before then, the purchasing of candidates and the purchasing of legislation. And now it's much, much worse because there's really no legal challenge to be brought against it. Heidi?
Let's see. Going back to an earlier question that I had about the commons and when the enclosure of it happened, and you said that it really got going in the 1500s. So that's about the time of the doctrine of discovery, late 1400s. So are you anyway,
they have anything to do with each other? Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So,
what came first?
And so did the Enlightenment philosophers. I tend to refer to them as propagandists for colonialism. When you theorize that the best of humanity, meaning the wealthy people, are superior to nature and separate from it. And by the way, superior to those non-Christian heathens over in North America. Oh, and by the way, superior to those Christian paupers in Ireland and everywhere else that you want to go. Before you build an empire, it's nice to have a group of scholastic folks get together and create the rationale for you doing what you plan to do, making it seem ethical and moral and the rest.
Right.
I'm trying to recall Bastiat and his, oh, here it is. You may recall this if you were here for the first session when I was reading from One Right to Rule Them All. That's the name of the introduction. And it starts with this quote from Frederick Bastiat. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men living together in society, they create for themselves in the course of time a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. Welcome to the Enlightenment.
Okay.
Now, certainly, now my philosophy professors would be screaming and tearing their hair out hearing me say that. Well, what about Locke? What about, the rights of man? What about all the... Yeah, that's great, except for who do you call man? Not women, by the way, and not poor people, by the way, and not Native Americans, or Native anybody, by the way. So tell me again about grand egalitarian nature of that philosophy. People who say things, propagandists, that's what I would refer to them as. But even propagandists tell the truth now and then. And even propagandists say things well. Well, of course they do. Who would believe them if they didn't? They're generally pretty eloquent. But it's worth looking at some of that philosophy through a different lens. And that's the lens of experience rather than the lens of being a philosophy student. And the difference is that when you just read it on the page, it all sounds beautiful. When you see how it's actually been lived, not so much.
Oh.
All right. So we will be, it's possible for you to go online and register for the January class. And so if you want to do that, go ahead and you'll get the Zoom link sent to you and so forth. So I sure hope to see you next time.